Good afternoon, everyone. What energy is here. I want to welcome you in the name of all of our Dominican sisters to our Associate Formation Program this year. We are so happy that you have chosen to share this special journey with us. We also welcome our associate candidates who are gathering in Chicago Heights, Columbia, Missouri, and Jackson, Mississippi. 3 different places that we are zooming into. There are 12 of them across the country. There are presently 38 associate candidates this year, and we really look forward to getting to know all of you. Candidates, thank you for your response to the invitation to be an associate. We extend a special thank you to the sisters who are your sponsors and to those who are serving sisters and associates as your prayer sponsors. They will accompany you through this formation process and share their experiences as Dominican sisters and associates. But all of our sisters will be holding you in prayer. All your names are on our bulletin board upstairs, so they already know a little bit about you. The Associate Formation Program provides opportunities for us to connect with each other, to build positive relationships as partners, together as community, to pray together, and to nourish our faith life. We will study the dimensions of church and the Dominican life, our charisms, which is rooted in the 4 pillars of prayer, study, community, and ministry. And we will look at the call that God gives to each of us to preach and live the gospel message in our daily lives and our varied ministries. We always begin our meetings with prayer, so I'd like to introduce our speaker today who's going to lead us in that prayer. Sister Susan Karina has traveled all the way from Jackson, Mississippi to be here today and brought with her one of our Jackson associates, Donna Reese. Donna, raise your hand so they can see you. Susan Karina joined the Springfield Dominicans in 1994. Before that, she was a museum curator at the Indiana State Museum, Indianapolis. She specialized in textiles and costumes, and her best-known exhibition was 25 years of Barbie dolls in 1985. She's also very knowledgeable about American architecture and furniture. Since 2014, Susan has been the Vice President of Mission Advancement, and recently at Jackson, Mississippi, our hospital changed our sponsorship there and gave it to the Franciscan Sisters, but we are continuing to work there. Susan writes, on July 1st, 2019, St. Dominic's became part of the Franciscan missionaries of Our Lady's Health System, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. We remember Dominic's words to Francis when they met in Rome at the Lateran Council. You are my companion. We will work together, supporting one another toward the same end, and no one will prevail against us. Wonderful, isn't it? There's that partnership and that companionship. So Sister Susan Karina has a PhD in American history. She specialized in medieval history. So in giving us the history of St. Dominic and St. Catherine, I think we're in for a treat. So Susan Karina.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to come to the Mother House, and I think this is about the 5th time that I've given this talk, and I refresh it every year, and I have some new images. But it was that study of history that was my introduction to the Dominicans. My major was American history and architectural history, but it was medieval history that was my introduction to the Dominicans, and you can see that it stuck. A couple of things for us to get started. Remember out there in Jackson, Chicago Heights, Columbia, and did I get all the locations? Yeah. Keep your sound on mute, and when you're ready, when we have our discussions, and if someone in your location wants to share with us, if you would please, at that point, unmute and probably wave to get someone's attention here so that we'll tune in. And before we go to the prayer, let me point out on the white sheet, that's your handout for today. There's a chronology about Dominic on the front, one of Catherine of Siena on the back, and then some bibliography and websites. And then on the bottom of the second page, there are some reflection questions that we will come to through the course of this presentation. And why the numeral 7 is in the lower left corner of that box, I have no idea. So you can just cross that one out. Now, for our opening prayer today, will be based on St. Dominic's a prayer, the hymn that we use to honor him, the Light of the Church. And so those folks that I talked to earlier, would you please come up? And if you would line up, preferably in order. So for the first one down here at this end, and the final person down here at this end. Okay, all together there we'll say those words that begin, O Light of the Church, and go on. And then we all say, O Light of the Church, and the first reader will give a very short meditation about that particular attribute of St. Dominic. So together, O Light of the Church,
Doctor of truth, rose of patience, ivory of chastity, freely have you dispensed the waters of wisdom. Preacher of grace, unite us to the blessed. Amen.
O Light of the Church.
Before he was born, Dominic's mother had a dream in which she gave birth to a black and white spotted dog carrying a torch in its mouth. We thank you, God, for the life of Dominic, whose preaching brought the light of Christ to those who lived in ignorance. Sustain the ministry of the Springfield Dominican Sisters and the Dominican Associates by allowing this same light to pass through us in every encounter.
Doctor of truth.
Dominic spoke the truth of Christ incarnate, and his preaching upheld the dignity of the human person as a gift of God. We ask you, God, help us to respond to the goodness of all creation and with due reverence to recognize those we serve as your children.
Rose of patience.
Dominic showed remarkable patience with his brethren and with church authorities. Help us, God, to be patient, not only with those we serve, but with the many others with whom we collaborate for the sake of ministry.
Ivory of chastity.
Dominic understood that chastity is a way of loving, which spends itself for the good of others. Help us, God, to honor our family members, friends, co-workers, and others through words and deeds that speak of you.
Freely have you dispensed the waters of wisdom.
Dominic freely shared his intellectual and spiritual gifts for the common good. Show us, God, how to use our gifts at prayer, at study, at meetings, and in every setting throughout the day.
Preacher of grace, unite us to the blessed.
Dominic's preaching built up unity among the faithful and the entire communion of saints. Help us, God, be preachers of grace, to build up the bonds of community within the associates and the congregation.
Eternal triune God, with gratitude for the life of St. Dominic, Light of the Church, we ask you to bless this session of associate candidate formation. Send the Holy Spirit to instruct us in wisdom, so that, like St. Dominic, we may continue to bring the light of Christ to the world.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your help with the prayer. Yeah, now I have 3 microphones. I'll just keep using the one that I've got in my hand. Yes, we're ready for our pictures here. Some of you, if you're from the Springfield area, you might remember Bishop George Lucas. And I worked for the diocese for several years, actually, as historian and archivist. And one of the questions he would often ask as he made his rounds throughout the diocese, he would ask, how are you proclaiming the gospel in your time and place? And I have found that question a rich source for meditation over the years. After all, we don't live in first century Palestine. We're not. We have a very different setting. Okay. Which I'll show you in a moment. Oh, I have to turn it in. I bet I don't have it on. There. And we don't live in the medieval Europe of Dominic or Catherine. But like them, through our baptism, God has called each of us to enflesh or incarnate Christ in our time and place. So whether that's in Springfield or the suburbs of Chicago, in the city of Lima, Peru, in Jackson, Mississippi, in the small towns on the Illinois prairie, or in the Andes at Harpa, we have each received this call. It is the same call that Dominic and Catherine received. It's not a different call, but it's a call to each one of us, and our circumstances are unique to our time and place. So today, I'm asking us to go back and look at the crossroads of time and place that produced the founder of the order and the foremost woman of the Dominican family, St. Catherine of Siena. And as we go along, I invite you to contemplate that intersection in your own life, and that will be a piece of our reflection questions later. I know it's on. Well, that would make, thank you. So Catherine was born about 175 years after Dominic, but they both inhabited that world of medieval Europe, or the Middle Ages, that time between the ancient Romans and the modern world of European nation states. There's a lot they have in common with us. Now, I have studied history most of my life, and my conclusion is human nature is constant over time. There are universal human needs for food, shelter, for relationship. And all cultures have rites of passage, birth, coming of age, marriage, death, and others. So we share our humanity with these figures, but the attitudes, the culture, the patterns of thinking and understanding the self and society are quite different. So let's peel back the layers of time. Before Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, we just had that 50th anniversary here recently. Before antibiotics, before Freud, before the Reformation. In Dominic's lifetime, considered that buttons were an innovation. You know, they used pins and clips and ties and things to hold their clothing together. Arabic numerals were replacing Roman numerals. Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris wouldn't be completed until 30 years after Dominic died. And St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, as we know it, didn't exist. It was what they then called, or we now call, the Old St. Peter's. And the printing press hadn't yet been developed. So I have a little medieval humor here for you. So everything had to be written by hand, all of Dominic's books, and I can see you can see it here. The scribe has fallen asleep. Darn, the copier broke down again. So how do we even know anything about Dominic and Catherine? Well, we have primary sources, documents that either they produced or were produced contemporary to them and about them. In this picture of Catherine, you see, you can probably make out the word dialogue. There are also her letters and prayers. So we have many of her words have been preserved. Almost all of them have been translated into English, and so some very good translations. Our Mother House Library has those, and they are available to you as associates. And of course, today, I mean, just go on Amazon. You can find these things. Accounts of Catherine's life by her confessor, Raymond of Capua, also give us a lot of insight about her life. These are what are called hagiography, sacred writing, and they're rather different than bibliography. Hagiography is usually a mixture of fact and legends. But the thing about hagiography and why it's so valuable is it conveys a truth about the spirit of the person. So not necessarily facts, but it does convey truth about that person. As far as Dominic and the sources, we have very little that has survived in the way of his own writings. But the early brethren, recognizing that he was something extraordinary, they compiled accounts of his life, and those have been handed on through the centuries. So in this presentation, I'm drawing upon biography and hagiography, as well as more general histories of the era. We know a fair bit about the worlds of Dominic and Catherine, and so here's a map of Europe about the time of Dominic's life. You recognize the contours of the European continent. Europe consisted of numerous kingdoms, some of them very small and a few large and powerful. One of the more powerful ones was Castile, where Dominic was born. And then notice the dominions there at northern Africa, the dominions of the Almoravides, the Moors, the Muslims, who by this point had influence and control, had moved from their origins in Arabia across northern Africa into Spain. And this becomes part of Dominic's story, is that borderland between the Moors and the Christians. Dominic was from Castile, Catherine was from Tuscany, and I've marked those places with the small black crosses that you see on the map here. So Dominic and Catherine. And then later we'll be talking about these spaces in between, especially around Toulouse and this region in southern France. Society was highly stratified. If you think there's a gap between the rich and poor today, it was even more pronounced in this time of history, and very little social mobility. Peasants were tied to the land, serfs. They can't leave the land without the permission, so they're not slaves in the sense of chattel slavery that we had in the United States, but they are tied to the land, and bonds of loyalty then to the land owners who provide protection and leadership. In Dominic's day, cities were growing larger: Paris, London, Florence, and Rome, and a merchant class was emerging. You see this in the city-states of Italy, of which Catherine lived in Siena. And I think it's very interesting that Dominicans flourished in the cities. We are really an urban order, in contrast to the rural settings for the Benedictines and the Cistercians and some of the monastic religious families. Here's Calaruega as it appeared in 2005 when I had the privilege of making the Lands of Dominic pilgrimage. He was born about 1171. His father was a local magistrate or judge. He was a leader in his small town. The large tower in the center of the picture here, this is the only structure that dates from Dominic's time. I know the rest of it still looks kind of ancient, as though it might have, but my understanding is that this tower, a watchtower, or the torreon in Spanish, survives from his time. Calaruega was near the frontier between Christian Castile and Muslim Spain. The landscape there, you get some sense of it. It reminded me a lot of the American Southwest. There are table mesas. And you can see the stratigraphy of the earth. There are chalk deposits there that are white, much like you might see the caliche deposits if you were going through West Texas. Herding was the mainstay of the economy. Dominic belonged to the second generation of Castilians who lived in this border region. The Torreon, as I mentioned, was part of a defensive frontier, and his father depended on the cooperation of the other men in their village to keep the order within their community. So here's part of that intersection of time and space. And there is this us and them mentality. There's us Christians and there's them Muslims. More about pluralism in a few minutes, because it's certainly part of the social context in which both of these saints lived. So Dominic grew up then in this time and place when the ordinary men, and I'm using the word men deliberately, had some influence then on that local governing structure. Did this later influence Dominic in the way he set up the order of preachers, which in comparison to many of the religious orders of the day was far more democratic in its structures? For example, among the Dominicans, a superior was elected for a term of office, not for life, like the Benedictines would have an abbot for life. So this is an innovation that might spring in part from Dominic's childhood and his early experiences, as well as looking at, well, what was the purpose of the order of preachers, and so what kind of leadership structure would serve it best. This picture at the right depicts his mother, and one of the legends, and it was alluded to in the prayer here, is that she had a dream where she gave birth to a dog carrying a torch in its mouth, a foreshadowing of Dominic as the light of the church. In the Torreon today, there are a series of windows depicting the life of Dominic. This is one of them. Another one of the pious legends concerns his grandmother. And she said that when he was baptized, there was a star upon his head. And so that a sign of special favor from God. This might be a sunbeam coming through the window of the church and striking the head of the child. But it tells us that at least in retrospect, people said, oh, there was something special about this man from very early in his life. When he was 7, his parents sent him away to school, and this was typical for boys of his social status. They would be educated under the care of a trusted relative or friend, and in his case, it was a priest who was in Palencia, a priest who was an uncle of his. He received a classical education, that is grammar, logic, arithmetic, higher mathematics, rhetoric, which is not what we think of. Rhetoric is public speaking, music, astronomy, and of course Latin, the language of the educated. I find it intriguing that we don't know Dominic's vocation story to the priesthood. I think we can make a lot of inferences about his calling to found an order, but in terms of becoming a priest, we don't have details there about that. It's not unusual that a family of his class would select one or more of its sons to be a priest, or at least nudge them in that direction, because church and civil life are very closely connected in this period of time. The church is the most powerful institution of its day, and so it would be important to have relatives who were priests and religious. It's likely that he was ordained, well, we know he was ordained, but that he was ordained in the 1190s, the early 1190s. And at some point early on in his priesthood, he was sent to the cathedral at Burgo de Osma, which is a fairly small town there in northern Spain. And these are pictures I took when I was there in 2005. The cathedral that you see here did not look like that at the time. But the wall, the city wall that you see, parts of that wall do date from Dominic's time. And the cloister, where I photoshopped Dominic into the cloister, that existed in the time of Dominic. So the cathedral, or the cathedral chapter, as they say, would be the priests who are around the bishop and assist him and have various duties within the cathedral community. Public preaching, though, was reserved to the bishop. And so most of the faithful, keep this in mind, most of the faithful, if you're not where the bishop was, you weren't going to hear Sunday homilies or Sunday sermons. That we just kind of take that for granted. But that was not the case, and this becomes an important part of Dominic's story. His bishop was Diego, who is pictured there on the left, Dominic to the right. Notice the books. Remember, they're all produced by hand. They represent a great investment in their education and their ongoing education. Now, this picture, by the way, is from the Nashville Dominican Mother House. Diego selected Dominic to accompany him on a diplomatic journey to Northern Europe, probably present-day Denmark, and this was to help arrange a royal marriage between a member of the royal family of Castile and with a royal in Northern Europe. It's about 1,000 miles as the crow flies. You got to cross the Pyrenees Mountains, and it's quite a journey. So the king sent gifts, which Diego would oversee and deliver, and so they needed pack animals. And they'd need saddle horses for the more important people in the party, which would probably Diego and probably Dominic. They would need interpreters, guides, men to care for the animals. In other words, it's a whole entourage. And so the picture in the background helps give you that idea that it's not just 2 by 2 that they're setting off to cross Europe. It's a whole caravan that's making the trip. It might seem odd to us that the king would send a bishop, but remember, church and state are intertwined by ties of mutual interest as well as ties of blood. And so those ties of personal loyalty are what held society together in his day. So now's our first opportunity to pause and reflect. So the questions are up here on the screen, and they're on the back of your paper. Think about the people and the places and the times that have shaped you. And even within this room where we have multiple generations, the things that have shaped some of us, weren't a factor for some of the rest of you. Or depending where you grew up. If you grew up in central Illinois, well, there's one thing. If you grew up in Mississippi, especially before the 1960s, there's a whole other cultural milieu, that's part of that. And then certainly for our associates who are in Peru, a different setting. So think about that. Was there a mentor or someone who influenced and nurtured your spirituality or your life direction? So I invite you at your tables, even in groups of 2 or 3 at your table so that more people have a chance to talk. Let's take about 6 or 7 minutes to do that. At this time, I would invite some large group sharing of your insights here. I heard lively conversation, love that. And for our folks at the remote locations, if there's something, share within your group, those who have a larger group. If you want to share something that you want us to hear, then you need to unmute. And like I say, wave. We'll maybe at this table you all can keep your eyes open. And finally, at Chicago Heights, we had a little sound issue. If you want to share something from Chicago Heights, call Sister Beth, and we'll get the thing set up. Okay. We have plans and backup plans for the backup plans. Yeah. Okay. Who would like to say something? I will bring the mic to you so that everyone can hear. Did you know it usually takes about 20 seconds for somebody to raise their hand? And I can wait.
We were talking about where we grew up and where we went to school and how that influenced us in terms of our spirituality. We didn't get to the second and third question. Just going around the table once was probably enough. But so I think for most of us, I think the sisters in the Catholic school or the local priest, in my case, Father Williams, but were, influential in terms of forming how we felt about our faith and the world around us. And my parents were also a big influence, as they are with probably most of us, But I don't know if anybody else wants to share.
Okay.
I don't see any.
Somebody else?
Mary Lou has encouraged me to share, but I'm from Watsika, Illinois, small farming community, and raised on a farm, one of 16 children. But it was my parents, my dad being a farmer, and my mom just being the workhorse. But it was during our family meals. Everything's very orderly. Got all these kids sitting down for a meal. Noon was the big dinner. But my dad would give homilies during the talk. It wasn't, the kids were not just crazy and wild, because we had to be quiet, and you spoke when you were spoken to. But loving, it wasn't like military, but so it was my dad that was the really main source of my faith, knowing when we had no money and just to make ends meet, but he could always give us faith.
Well, we can take time for one more.
Thank you. At our table, we were all talking that the biggest impact of spirituality, besides parents, was the nuns, because we were all products of a Dominican grade school.
Okay.
So the Dominicans themselves.
That's, it is not surprising that many Dominican associates would have been influenced by the Dominicans that they have met. I'm curious, I know we have associates who are not Catholic. Would any of them like to chime in with anything?
Well, around this table, let me back up first. I grew up as a Presbyterian, my youth and my early adulthood. And I lived in St. Louis at the time. And I've done a lot of church hopping since then. And I am currently a member of a non-denominational faith community here in Springfield. Around this table, we have folks who are from the big city of Detroit. We have folks from Springfield. We have folks from College Town, U of I. And we have a couple of us who were farm people, born on the farms. And that's about all we got to do. And all the time you gave us to that.
Thank you, Doug. You can see there is just here for conversation, of course, beyond today's presentation. And I'd mention about that intersection of time and place, just a little bit about my own story. I grew up Lutheran, and it was my Lutheran confirmation pastor who made a huge difference in my life. That was part of my awakening about racism, came from that pastor. And I think he saw something in me about preaching. I was invited to preach one Sunday when he was away. I was like 17 years old. And I later, before I entered, I got in touch with him and I said, you know what? You had the right pew, the wrong church. So let's go on with that story of Dominic and Catherine. And we'll switch back here to the pictures. Now, that journey to the north was a life-changing one for Dominic. It was his first encounter with a religious sect called the Cathars, Cathers, and it comes from a Greek word that means the pure ones. And they were dualist, and what made them dualist, there were two gods, a god of good and a god of evil. The god of good was spiritual, ethereal, non-material, and the god of evil was material, earthy, human bodies, all the material things. And actually, if you want to know more about Catharism, the entry in Wikipedia is actually a pretty good overview, would be a place to get started. And more about the origins and how did it come to be in southern France and northern Italy and so forth. They were especially strong around the city of Albi, and so sometimes they're called Albigensians. And they were very numerous in this region of southern France. I guarantee you I have looked up the pronunciation more than once, the Languedoc. In the city of Toulouse, Diego and Dominic stayed at an inn run by a Cathar, and Dominic and the innkeeper talked far into the night. And this is a picture I especially like. One of the things, I have looked at thousands of pictures of saints over the years, and usually there is the saint in pristine isolation. And yet so much of their life is, why they're important is because of their interactions with others. So I was glad to find this picture of Dominic and the innkeeper. And you'll notice there's food on the table and there are bottles of wine, or there are cups of wine. They talked far into the night about their differing beliefs. And by morning, the innkeeper had decided to return to the Catholic faith, to become a Christian. Now, undoubtedly, Dominic had preached before, but this is the first record of his preaching. And this depiction, historical depictions, interestingly, are often show the innkeeper at the feet, kneeling down in front of Dominic. This is another reason I like this picture, is it shows them on the same plane, and they're engaged in conversation. So I think we see a couple of things about this incident that it says something to us about Dominic, his concern for an eternal soul of each individual, and his willingness to engage in conversation, especially to engage the ideas and the arguments of the other party. In Catholic understanding, the Cathars were heretics. And it's a word, sometimes it gets thrown around way too casually. I've taken, this definition comes from later than Dominic's day, but still within that medieval mentality, a species of infidelity in persons who, having professed the faith of Christ, corrupt its dogmas. And in the Cathars, you see a respect for Jesus. But let me move on here to their propositions of faith you can look at while I say a little bit more about this. But that to them, Jesus wasn't a real person, because a real person, a human body, is corrupt and evil, and so it was a good spirit under this appearance of a human body. And so Jesus, in other words, there was no incarnation, no resurrection. I mean, basic tenets of the Catholic faith, the Cathars had rejected. Heresy was understood by them to be a very grave sin because it deprived that soul of the possibility of salvation. And it was dangerous because it could spread to others. And so this is why there are such stringent punishments for heresy within the lifetime of Dominic and at other periods of church history as well. It threatens the social order. To the medieval mind, the heretics and faithful couldn't coexist, although it's very interesting with these Cathars that there are enclaves of them where the population is largely Cathar. But it also, part of the historical documentation of this period is that many Catholics had Cathar members in their family, or they knew them, or they traded with them as merchants and so forth. But there's toleration as we think of it was foreign to the mindset of this period of history. And as far as those characteristics, I'm not going to go into that in terms of our interest of time, but that wiki article is a good place to start if you want to know more about their beliefs. So Dominic is concerned about the well-being of the eternal souls of these people, and Diego as well. The Pope had already authorized some special missions to the Cathars, and there were members of other religious orders who were part of that. Dominic and Diego get connected to them, and they meet more of the Cathars. Remember, they finish that journey to Denmark, and they come back, and they have to go back to Denmark again, or to wherever it was in Northern Europe. So they're covering a lot of ground. It's late in the year of 1206 that they began to spend time in Fanjeaux, France, which is in southern France and also near a little tiny village called Prouy. There was a rundown church at Prouy, and they used that as their headquarters. They would pray and then go out to the different cities to have disputations, to have debates with Cathar leaders. In these debates, I've never seen any images that include Cathar women. But they must have been listening because some of them wanted to come back to the church. And this presents Dominic and Diego with a conundrum. These women have renounced Catharism. Their families, don't want to have anything to do with them. They're Cathar families. So what will become of them? And part of the stories about Dominic is that he prays about this, and he's in the town of Fanjeaux, which is up on a high ground, and he's looking out over the valley that you see here. And 3 nights in a row, he sees a ball of fire in the sky over this little bitty village of Prouy. And this is it. We should gather these women at Prouy to become a monastery of nuns. And we mark that as the beginnings, the unofficial beginnings of the Order of Preachers, is the gathering of these nuns under the direction of Dominic and Diego. And there's a stained glass representation of that. And that today, that's the big chapel, or the basilica at Prouy. And then this is a familiar site. I believe we still have this picture up here in the Mother House. That is the gathering of those first women who would later become Dominican nuns. That ball of fire, by the way, is called the sign of God, the Signa Deo. Their prayer and their penance would become a support for the preaching mission. And it seems to be about this time that Dominic and the others start to refer to themselves as the holy preaching. And this is what Fanjeaux, as it looks today, you get that sense of it's being built on a hill. And so from these places, the Dominic and Diego and the other priests who have joined with them go out on these missions to speak with Cathars and to hold these debates. There's a couple of depictions here about these disputations. In Dominic's time, debate is not what you see on TV today. Let's be really clear about that. It's a very organized discussion of bringing these ideas to each side, making its case for the truth, or what they view as the truth. And in one of these debates, they decide to test, it's called ordeal by fire. And here again, this is part of the medieval mentality that we find just strange. But they would take their respective holy books, here we go, cast them into the fire. And here you can see their books burning up. But here's the book that Dominic tosses into the fire. We're not sure. It was probably not a complete Bible. It may have been one of the Gospels. But it flies out undamaged, and that happened more than once. And so in their mind, that's a sign that, well, that's the truth. Or it would have just burned up like these other books. Then on the other picture, I like this one a lot. So here's Dominic preaching. Oh, sorry. And you can see the range of response he's getting. You know, here's this guy saying, "You're crazy, I'm not going to listen to you anymore." Here are a couple of fellows who look like they're trying to make their own points. Here's a fellow who's turned away. There are a couple who, this man looks like maybe he's taken some serious consideration of what he's hearing. So a whole range of response. And I think, you know, any of you who are teachers, preachers, anything, you know that. You know the looks on these faces. You've experienced those. Then there's a little Dominican humor down here, the dogs. Notice the dogs. Here are the black and white spotted dogs. That represents the Dominicans. And they're guarding a sheep. Okay, so here's someone who's returned to the fold and they're guarding the sheep. They're guarding the faithful. And here's one of the Cathar dogs who's got a sheep in his teeth trying to steal it and get away. And one of Dominic's dogs is going after it. And one of the this has been a joke in the order for hundreds of years, that in Latin you can make a little play on word, and the Dominicans are the Dominicanes, the dogs of the Lord. We are the dogs of the Lord. But for the most part, they're not having much success with this preaching mission. And Diego, who is shown here at the lower left, and Dominic, engaged with the Cathars, it's not going very well. Eventually, Diego has to go back to his cathedral in Osma. He died in 1207. This must have been a terrible loss for Dominic, for his mentor to die. I put this quote here. It's attributed to Dominic because it shows you the insight that he gained from these experiences with the Cathars. And how do you persuade people of the truth of Christ? Zeal must be met by zeal, humility by humility, false sanctity by real sanctity, preaching falsehood by preaching truth. Consider about the humility. Remember I mentioned about the entourage with the horses and the servants and so forth? Well, Dominic and Diego had the insight to say, you know, we should give up the horses and the entourage. The Cathars had this very austere lifestyle. So if you want to get the Cathars to pay attention to you, leave the horses behind. You know, have this very austere lifestyle yourself, and that will help raise your credibility with this audience. False sanctity replaced by real sanctity. Preaching falsehood by preaching truth. So this is the what part of the heart of the Dominican founding is that meeting people where they are. Earlier in the year in 1207, there were other Cistercians who had joined their mission, and eventually they fall away. And then there was the new bishop in Osma was very supportive of Dominic, and he was allowed to stay in southern France. But this was now some of the darkest days for Dominic and the few who stayed on in this preaching mission. One of their Cistercian companions was assassinated by a Cathar. And this is when the Pope, then Innocent III, says enough is enough and calls a crusade against the Cathars. And this is just a picture of the lane at Pruy today and the Basilica today. Here's from a medieval manuscript about the expulsion of the Cathars from one of their cities. Make no mistake, this was a brutal persecution of the Cathars. And it continued even for 8 years after Dominic's death. It would be many, many years before there was a real settlement here, and that Catholic leaders are again in charge, and the Cathars either move on to other places or they go underground. It was a lonely and dangerous time for Dominic. This is on the path between Fangeau and Prouy. And these are Dominican sisters from various congregations when we walked that path in 2005. It's called the Assassin's Cross because this is a location where there was an attempt on the life of Dominic. And Dominic, again, typical of his medieval mentality, would have welcomed martyrdom. And a lot of saints desire to be martyrs. And some of them, became that, and some were not. Dominic was spared and lived to preach another day. What did Dominic think of the crusade? Well, we don't have any direct evidence. He was closely associated with Simon de Montfort, the Crusader, who was the Viscount of one of the towns in this region of France. And over the years, de Montfort provided land, exemptions from taxation, and other assistance to Dominic. The stories passed on by the brethren never portray Dominic as bloodthirsty or rejoicing in the downfall, even of people he may have looked upon as enemies or as heretics. Our great Dominican historian Vicaire claims that Dominic did not directly cooperate in the crusade in any way. Did he feel that the crusade was justified? Well, again, we don't have any direct kind of evidence. I can only imagine that it must have been a source of great sadness to Dominic and to the other brethren who had begun to gather by that time, that these matters could not be resolved without recourse to violence. It's during this period that there's a bishop in Toulouse who becomes a supporter of Dominic. And they're welcomed then to that city of Toulouse, and they're given license to preach in the churches that are under that bishop's jurisdiction. And here is where the holy preaching began to assume a more formal structure. And this building, parts of which date back to the time of Dominic, is still there, and you can go into it, and there's a lot of our Dominican art. Here's a picture of what it may have looked like, and notice these very distinctive openings, and here you see this. So Toulouse becomes the headquarters. The bishop's mandate, the bishop of Toulouse, was to root out corruption of heresy, to drive out vice, to teach the creed, and inculcate in men sound morals. Notice here that they're to preach to heretics and to the faithful. There's the importance of good catechesis, faith formation, the term we would use today. And I think there you have the genius of the order of preachers, is the theological formation. The bishop entrusted the mission to them in perpetuity within his diocese. But what about all those other dioceses where the Cathars are strong and where the people are thirsting for religious formation? So there is a beginning of a more formal structure here, and under the direction of the bishop, or I should say under the authorization of the Bishop of Toulouse, they are to be mendicant. That is, they can wander about and beg for their subsistence, for food and for the things that they need. The Dominican historian Hinnebusch says that the Dominicans were mobile monks. They weren't tied to one monastery, mobile monks. And their tonsure, that is the haircut they had, was something between that of the monks enclosed in their monasteries and the secular clergy. And here's the takeaway here from this picture. And here, notice we have Dominic, we've got the dog with the torch, we've got the star on the head, we've got, lots of the symbols or attributes as they are called. Mental work replaces manual labor. The Cistercians, the Benedictines, the great religious orders up to that time, prayer and work, ora et labora. But for Dominicans, the mental work, study, becomes a very important aspect of the life. On the left, you see St. Peter's as it would have appeared in the day of Dominic, and then this is Pope Innocent III. In the fall of 1215, he accompanies the bishop to Rome for the Lateran Council, which is an international church council. Dominic's now about 43, and he and the bishop think the time is right to formalize the structure for the holy preaching. And so Dominic meets with the Pope. It's also at this time, we think very late in 1215 or early in 16, that he meets it wasn't St. Francis then, but he meets Francis of Assisi. And so various documents are drawn up and so forth that gives recognition to an order which doesn't yet have a name, but will have that mandate to preach publicly, not just in that one diocese, but anywhere in the church. Here in what one of our historians has said about their first constitution, it was emphasized that it was known from the beginning to have been, the order was instituted especially for preaching and the salvation of souls. And that confirmation was issued then in December of 1214. And then there's another bull in 2016, which establishes that name, the Order of Preachers, or they were called the Order of Friars Preachers. And I mentioned Dominic meeting Francis, and of course this has become a very dear image to us in Jackson now that we have Franciscan sponsorship. This picture is like our touchstone, and that quote is our touchstone as we go through that transition of governance. There are many stories about Dominic then. So the Order of Friars Preachers comes into existence. And you might think, oh, here's our time to consolidate, but this is when he sends out. He sends out the brethren and even novices to Paris, to Bologna. He sends them out to study so that they can receive the first-class education of their day. Many of them lack degrees in theology, and so he sends them out. And he has these words, echoing the words of Jesus, "Do not worry about what you are to preach. God will put power in your mouth." And I can tell you, and I think anybody in here who's done any pulpit preaching or been in other situations, you prepare. Of course you prepare. You study the scripture. You pray. You reflect. And then there are those situations where things come up and you trust the power of God to put the right words in your mouth, and they're there. From the earliest days, Dominic and the other first leaders of the order made provisions for study. And they were a clerical institute. That is, it was an institute of priests. And at this period in history, there were brothers who did the more menial task and so forth. Today, they're called cooperator brothers, and they too are theologians and teachers and do the other sorts of things that historically were not open to them. The Pope makes the gifts of some of the properties in Rome. He asked Dominic to organize some nuns at San Sisto, and this would be where Catherine of Siena would die. And in 1220, they received Santa Sabina, which was one of the oldest churches in Rome. You have the picture there of the exterior and the interior and the upper tier there. And where you see that image, that mosaic of Dominic, that's a spot in the floor. You can just barely make it out here, but then here's a little more detail. And this is where the brethren often observed Dominic stretched out on the floor in prayer through the night. It is a very special place for anyone who's associated with the Order of Preachers. As I mentioned before, the Dominicans are among the first to have a rather democratic structure. of themselves. And this is worked out in their first and second general chapter. If you're not familiar with that language of a chapter or a general chapter, it's like a convention where the religious community comes together to take a look at their life and to make decisions together about their life, which their leaders then will be expected to carry out. I think one of the most important things then to remember about Dominic at this end stage of his life is that he assured there was a structure in place so that the preaching mission could continue. The holy preaching could continue. It was not dependent on the personality of Dominic. Occasionally in the church there have been orders or there are other organizations that are so dependent on a charismatic founder. And once the founder is gone, what happens? I think some folks had concern about Mother Teresa. And what would happen when Mother Teresa died? What would become of the missionaries of charity? And they seem to be going along just fine. But that certainly is a concern when you're beginning something, that there are structures as well as people who have been formed who can carry on the mission. And I think that speaks to me in part about having Dominican Associates. Is we have this charism for preaching, for bringing the light of Christ to the world. And for many, many years now, we have reached out to Christian laity to share in that mission. Dominic died and was buried in Bologna. There are some wonderful stories around his death, but we're going to keep moving on right now. He was entombed at the church you see here in Bologna, now called San Domenico. And some years later, it was necessary to move the remains because they were going to do an expansion. And when Dominic then, when they moved what they called the translation of the body, a fine new tomb was commissioned by Michelangelo, which you can see today if you were to visit this church. Among his parting words were these: "Have charity for one another, guard humility, make your treasure out of voluntary poverty." Oops. So Dominic, light of the church, doctor of truth, rose of patience, ivory of chastity, ushered his companions through turbulent times. He secured the future for the order and the preaching mission. He developed an order of friars, brothers, who were mobile and learned, mental work, not manual work, and they studied for the sake of mission. They were poor, and they begged when they traveled. He set in motion a timeless mission. The holy preaching endures and will endure for ages to come. And so with this, we'll take a break, about 10 minutes? I think Sister Joan has something to say to you. We've been at this for about an hour now, so we'll have a short break.
That I started going more out to Holy Family.
I'm going to go ahead
Getting them out of the car.
and begin. So if you would, if you haven't come back to your place yet, just do so quietly. Let's continue with about Catherine of Siena. We'll have the picture up here in a moment. I'll tell you, the picture I had of Dominic and this one, they're by Maureen Carey. And one of the things I like about her artwork is there's such a sense of motion with these two saints. Yes. Yeah, we'll start with this one. Now, like Dominic, she was born in the Middle Ages, and yet her time and place shaped her along somewhat different lines. The most significant difference is that Catherine was a woman. And sex roles, gender's a recent concept. Sex roles were very rigid. And far more so than for us in the late 20th and the early 21st century. We live in a period of unprecedented sex integration in our workplaces, at church, and in this room. And her social setting was somewhat different than that. And you'll see that Catherine had her own ideas about appropriate behavior. She is born into Italy, where the city-states are a dominant factor of life, and in this region of Tuscany. Here's a picture of Siena, the main piazza, and in the right background is the Church of San Domenico. Here we go. This was her parish church. It's huge. And this is for the benefit of the folks in Jackson. This church and the cathedral church. Oops. Gosh, hit the wrong thing. There's the cathedral church. These are even bigger than the biggest Baptist church that you will find in a southern city. And let me tell you, they build them big. Okay. And a couple other things I'll point out about what her town looks like. Her father had a wool dyeing business, and so it's a multi-story complex. And in the lower level were the vats for the dyeing. Here you see San Domenico again, and then down the hill, these buildings here. This is Benincasa, the home of Catherine of Siena. It didn't look like that at her time. In fact, to see this building, and it is open to the public, it's a real mishmash of different periods and even different owners within the complex. Some is owned by the nation, some's owned by the local sisters. It's quite a place, but you can go there to the shrine of Catherine of Siena. And then on down the hill, something that dates from her time is, see this structure here? That's a public fountain. There's water that runs through there. The Fonte Brada, it's called. So kind of this is her neighborhood, if you will. She came from a very large family. I heard someone say what? How many brothers and sisters were mentioned earlier? 16? 26. From one mother. Some of them were twins, multiple sets of twins. And Catherine herself was a twin whose mate died at birth. She was the youngest in the family. So imagine what life must have been like in this household. And her older siblings would have been probably a great deal older, maybe out in their own households. But this had to be a busy place. Noisy and constant activity. Now, consider that she lived in Siena, which was often a violent place with feuding factions. And she lived through one of the outbreaks of bubonic plague. So a time of a lot of political unrest is part of the cultural environment for Catherine. Here's Benincasa as it appears today, and a famous statue in the shrine there that has been copied many times. And in fact, in Jackson, or actually in Madison, Mississippi, where we have St. Catherine's Village, a retirement community, we have a reproduction of this statue in the garden there. Then I have the little insert here that represents her earliest religious vision. She was a very pious child, and it's when she's only 7 or 8 years old that she makes a vow of virginity, and that she's going to have a life of service to God, a relationship where the God quest, as we might say today, was the most important thing in her life. But she had chores. One of her chores was to go to this fountain and get water to bring back up the hill, if you can imagine what that must have been like. And years later in her writing, she uses the images of a cup of water that is constantly filled to overflowing. And the water flows through this fountain it's kind of interesting. At the one end, the water flows in from this. I'm fumble fingers. The water flows in from this side. So this is where the water that the people would drink would take their water from here. And then in the second place here, that's where the animals would drink. And then in the third one, that would be where, people could, wash clothes or, the least sanitary things would be there and then flowing on out. So imagine the water flowing, that sense of motion that captures in her image. Her writings are very rich in the use of metaphors. This is from an icon at St. Catherine of Siena Church in Metairie, Louisiana. It was the very first Catholic church I was ever in. That was for my cousin's wedding in 1966. And so every time I go to visit Becky, I say, let's go see the icon. Let's visit this icon. And then there's some miniatures at the bottom of it. And one of them is she cuts her hair. You're like, oh, big deal. She cuts her hair. Probably 2/3 of the women in this room have short hair. Maybe more than that. But for a girl of her social standing, she would be expected to marry when she reached her mid-teens. It's not about falling in love. It's about what is advantageous for our family and this family that you marry into. Marriages were arranged. So her parents began to set things up as she reached marriageable age, and she cut her hair in an act of defiance to show that she had no intention of marrying. She had already promised herself to Jesus. And keep in mind that in this day and age, women who entered the monastery, part of that ceremony is cutting the hair and taking the veil. It's taking yourself. Part of it is it's taking yourself out of the marriage market. There are whole books written about this kind of thing. But the symbolism here is not to be missed. So it was a definite no to marriage, and her parents got the message. She wanted to join a group of lay Dominicans called the Mantellate for the capes that they wore. These were women who were widowed. And as widows, they had a certain freedom to go out into the town so they would visit the sick and take food to the needy and engage in acts of good work. She's like 17, 18 years old, and she's not married, and she wants to become part of the Mantellate. Her parents say no, and as a punishment for cutting her hair, they made her do menial tasks within the household that would ordinarily be done by servants. Catherine imagines herself serving Christ, and that's is a theme you see returning over and over again in her writings and in those hagiographical writings about her. Eventually, her parents relented, and she was allowed to join the Mantellate. This is the interior of San Domenico and looks not terribly different than it did in her time. The lay Dominican women sat at the back on there's a raised platform, and they would visit, come every day. Now, Catholics didn't receive Holy Communion daily. That comes much later in our history as the church. So she would be back there, and in fact, the picture you see here is a fresco that you can still see that's on the wall. There in San Domenico. They would then visit the sick for works of mercy and charity, and they were reluctant to accept her, but they did. And then this is kind of seems typical of Catherine. She fights to get into the Mantellate. She wants to join them in their good works, and then she secluded herself in her room for almost 3 years. And during this time, she faces many trials and temptations. And as you can imagine, her parents are not too happy with her. She still has to do some work around her home and so forth. She eats very, very little. But at the end of that 3 years, the turning point is when she has a mystical experience that we call mystical marriage or mystical espousal, in which Catherine sees that in this case, it's the Virgin Mary and the Christ child come to her so that Catherine is wed to Jesus. And this idea of spiritual espousal to our modern minds can seem even downright weird. Although I assure you, to many religious, it's a metaphor that still has a great deal of meaning. But it shows you the closeness of the relationship that she had with Christ. That she sees it as like a marriage, that it's lifelong, it's exclusive, it is total dedication. At her request, he gave Christ gave her a ring which at her request was visible only to herself. And then the other picture I have here is Catherine receives the stigmata, the wounds of Christ. And again, this is not unusual. Actually, both of these phenomena are not unusual in the lives of women saints from this period of history. And you may be aware of within the Catholic tradition, there are people who have received the wounds of Christ that are visible. Padre Pio comes to mind. St. Francis. And for Catherine, these were not visible, but very real, and a source of great pain and suffering, and another way of penance for her. And like the mystical espousal, gives you a sense of the great intimacy that she had with Christ. By this time of her life, she lives on little more than water and some raw vegetables. Today, she might have been diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, but that is to retroject understandings that we have, back into the past. And one of the books that I put down on your list there, if you want to know more about this, is called Holy Anorexia. For Catherine, the Blessed Sacrament, the consecrated communion host, was the food that sustained her. I mentioned that the laity didn't receive daily, even usually once a year was typical. And one of the stories handed on about her is that the consecrated host would fly from the hands of the priest back to that part of the church where she was sitting, and that Jesus himself would give her communion. Within the writings about Catherine, after that 3-year period then begins her period of active ministry. And she does go out, and there are a number. She visits prisoners. She visits the sick. She goes on diplomatic missions. She preaches publicly, and the crowds are so moved to confession and penance that the order sends priests along with her so they can hear the confessions and give absolution to these penitents. She's a patron saint of nurses, and I've just recently started reading a fairly new book about this, Catherine of Siena and healthcare, this care for the sick. Remember, it's the time of plague and other diseases. More people died of infections than they do today because we didn't have any effective ways of treating infections. She visited the sick in the hospitals of Siena as well as in their homes. And I've included a couple pictures here to give you a sense of this. Oops. This was the big hospital, Maria da Scala, in Siena. The building still exists today. Now, to give you an idea of the interior, this is not the same hospital. This is the Hotel Dieu in Paris, which still exists. Not like this, but it still exists. And these hospital, I guess what we would call a ward, they're like the nave of a church. And so there's an altar down at one end, and then there are the beds where the sick are placed along the sides. So this would be what a hospital was like in her day. Nursing could make the difference between life and death if the person's constitution was strong enough to resist the infection or the illness that they had. Having adequate food and water, and nursing care could make the difference. But there is more to care than for the physical body. And Catherine and the other caregivers of the Montellate minister to the soul. They see caring for the sick as caring for Christ, as indeed is the animating principle behind Catholic healthcare ministry today. That we are there to recognize and minister to Christ in those who come to us, and we bring Christ to them. I included this picture, to tell you the truth, I included this picture because I just think it's so awesome. and it's so vivid, compared. It's a contemporary depiction of Catherine. And there she is holding the lilies, one of her symbol of purity, holding the cross. There you see the Holy Spirit and the church and the scriptures and the writings. And one of her more famous sayings, be who God meant you to be, and you will set the world on fire. And you recall that Jesus has words that are similar to this in the gospel. We say, I have come to set the world on fire, and how I wish it were already burning. When we respond to God's call, whether that's to religious life or to marriage or to a particular profession, or some other thing for which we have been called, it makes a difference for the world. A call to be a Dominican Associate, part of that is your own spiritual edification. But it's more than that. If it stops there, we've missed the point. It's embracing a call that is for the life of the world, as we talk about in our most recent general chapter. It's about how are you going to make a difference in the world in your day and time, going back to that thought about how we incarnate things in our particular way. I'm going to skip over some of the other more dramatic miracles and visions and so forth in the interest of time, because I want to be sure we have time for some of the reflection questions. Catherine, as a diplomat, though, she... some historians give her a great deal of credit for helping return the papacy to Rome. There was a time when it wasn't safe for the Pope to be in Rome. He was in Avignon, France, and she convinces the Pope to return. And so let's pause to reflect before we talk about the end of her life. We've looked at these two saints now. What are the attributes that you admire the most? And what traits do you see within yourself or within another associate or within a sister that you've identified in Dominic and Catherine? And then this has been a fun one, especially with children. If the church ever recognized you as a saint, what symbols are they going to put in your picture? Take a few minutes. We have about another 10 minutes or a little more here, so take at least 5 or 6 minutes here at your tables again, if you would, please.
Oh, you're going to turn that into a lesson.
Any question? You don't have to take those in order or try to do all of them. Take what strikes your fancy there at your group. It's edifying to see the lively conversation, and I hope you'll continue after our conclusion today. And I would hope, feel free, of course, to use those reflection questions for your personal reflection after today. Catherine died in Rome in 1380. In those final months of her life, she was in constant pain, some of it because of the rigors of her self-imposed diet and mortification, that is self-punishments that she would inflict upon herself. She offered up her suffering for the unity of the church, and for the sins of the world. And in one of her final visions, she felt the bark of Peter, or the ship of Peter, the church as a ship, crushing her under its weight, holding that ship on her shoulders. Sometimes some of the icons of Catherine show her with a ship on her shoulders. I think an image which resonates to the present day. She died on April 30, which in that year was a Sunday before the Ascension. Her feast day is now observed in the current calendar on April 29. Now, a desire to be close to the holy ones. Oh, first a word about this depiction of her death. You see, notice she's surrounded by her loved ones and some of her family members. But this is a medieval depiction of death. So here you have the person who is commended. One of her last words would be to commend herself to God. And then this represents the rising of her soul to heaven. There's a desire to be close to the body of the holy ones in the medieval mind. Siena and her hometown and Rome argued over the disposition of her remains. Not unlike the arguments over the disposition of Bishop Sheen, New York or Peoria. And for now, at least, Peoria has won. But I'll tell you, if you look in history, a translation isn't necessarily the last translation you're going to see. But Rome and Siena were arguing over this. And so the uncorrupted head of Catherine is in Siena at San Domenico. You can see her head. It's like mummified. And her body then was entombed at the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. I know that I can see from your faces that, remember, this is the medieval mind at work, how they would address these things, and this idea of relics, either little bits of bone from the saint or something that had been touched to the saint, would have. Let's go back to that idea of hagiography, conveys something of the truth of that person. So this idea of relics help us to call to mind something of the spirit of that person. So Dominic and Catherine have inspired generations of members of the Dominican family. And in them we have not just examples, but a brother and sister in Christ to each one of us. I think one of the beauties about the communion of saints is that we are connected. We are dwellers all in time and space, as one of our hymns has it. They're real. We're in a real relationship with them, even though it's of a different quality than the relationship we have with each other in this room. They inspire, accompany, and they share our trials and joys. So as you leave today, I invite you to spend some time with this final question. How are you preaching the gospel in your everyday life? I think you'll also find that a helpful meditation as we move next spring and you're working on your associate commitment statement, which uses slightly different words, but it's the same idea here. And I hope that in learning about Catherine and Dominic and reflecting on how you preach the gospel in everyday life, that you feel a little closer to them than you did before. They will help us draw closer to Christ and to one another. So thank you and God bless.
Thank you, Susan Karina. We're very, very grateful. I think her knowledge of medieval history has made a tremendous difference in this presentation. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes.
And thank you for the hagiography as well as the history. The next time that we meet will again be the second Sunday of the month because Right to Life Sunday is the first Sunday, and so we'll be meeting on October 13th. And that presentation will be given by Sister Marilyn Jean Runkle, who's here with us today. And it's going to be Dominican spirituality, the 4 pillars of Dominican life. So we'll look forward to Sister's presentation. I'd like to thank our technology people. As you see, they spend many hours preparing, making the contact. Thank you to Aaron, who gives up his Sunday here, and to Sister Beth Murphy also, who work in our technology department. On one of the last Sundays of the month, and this September, it's September 22nd, Sister Beth conducts in our chapel the history of our chapel with the architecture and the windows. And so you are welcome to attend that or to bring friends or your family to that presentation. Again, that will be on September 22nd this month, right, Beth?
It's always the 4th Sunday, not necessarily the last.
Right. And so the time is?
1:30.
Okay, 1:30 in the afternoon. If you would like, you could call and let her know that you would like to be part of it. Any questions that anyone has or comments you'd like to make today? Okay, thank you very much for your presence with us, and blessings as we move into this colorful season of autumn. Certainly God's gift. So bless you all. Safe travels. Oh, yes, could we please ask you to take your name tags off, leave them on the table. I'd like to thank Sister Bernice, who helped us organize our name tags, get them ready, so we want to be sure we keep them. And all of the cans and glasses go on the cart on the side. There's a cart right outside, right inside the door.